David, I'm not sure if all of our new viewers realize how far ahead you've been in some of the things you've been telling us about for years that now appear to be playing out before our very eyes. Welcome, David, to this special presentation of David Hawkins' Discovery CSI. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you, Jason. Good to be with you.
And life under lockdown there in Canada, everything all right? What's it like in Vancouver?
Yeah, semi-lockdown. Parks are closed. Everyone is heavily discombobulated. A lot of people have lost their jobs. There's an air of despair amongst many of the people I know, and we need to straighten it out fast.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things that I've been trying to do, David, is to just go around New York City and show everyone what's there. You know, just point the camera at what's going on and ask the most obvious questions. I think a lot of people have this sense that the response from governments around the world and the information that we're hearing in the mainstream news, it doesn't seem to make logical sense when they compare it to what they see at their local hospitals and just, you know, what people would expect from this type of worldwide, you know, lockdown. It's a very, very extreme measure. One of the things that we've been doing, David, I think a lot of people know that you and I have a weekly show on Fridays, and that's Discovery CSI, David Hawkins Discovery CSI. Normally people need to be sponsors, either on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. But this week, the first week of April, we're offering all of the sponsor exclusive shows on the open platforms so everyone can become familiar with my co-hosts and the different shows that we offer to people who do become sponsors. And David, there's something about David Hawkins' Discovery CSI, more than one something, that's particularly important to what we're all experiencing right now. Why don't you lead us into this? And I think we've got a really unique opportunity to help people out there who perhaps have never heard of SERCO, have no idea how patents play into all of this, how the BBC plays into all of this, and how fake news is not just a hashtag shoved out onto Twitter by President Donald Trump, but a truly dangerous aspect of all of this.
Oh, thank you for that lead-in, Jason. And absolutely, the BBC was formed, I think, in 1924 and has become the premier engine for news, entertainment, and propaganda right through World War II, right through the Cold War. We have various people actually doing some very important spy work in World War II, and we go through to this incredible organization called SERCO, which used to be called RCAGB 1929. So it's got a long pedigree. And RCAGB 1929, with its parent company in the United States, effectively grandfathered all of the important communications technologies into the modern world. In particular, SERCO has somehow, unbelievably, been contracted by the United States government to run your patent office. And on November the 17th of last year, a British company that is very suspect, I believe it's a racketeering, influenced and corrupt organization, announced that it had processed using artificial intelligence techniques a 4 millionth patent for the United States, with a total of 10 million patents actually registered and processed up to the present. That was announced, and you recently had a little interview with Wilbur Ross, which I thought was staggering because he didn't want to know that SERCO was processing United States patents, which is kind of important because a number of those patents, I believe, have been cobbled together, and I list them in my template at Reverse CSI Scripts, have been cobbled together and create an extraordinary opportunity for fake news to somehow morph into real news, or at least it's presented in real news. So I link this brilliant documentary, well, it was many ways, it was brilliant, but it was actually, how shall I put it, somewhat disingenuous, I think is the right word, by the BBC. It was called Contagion! And there was a group of researchers, including a mathematician from Imperial College and from Cambridge that put together a template of algorithms that purported to show how a digital virus, that is one planted on those cell phones that you're seeing there, might spread around the world, where the computer was programmed to say, if either one of those researchers spent, let's say, 1 minute within 10 feet of another party, a volunteer carrying a similar machine, then the computer would infer or imply or adjust or basically deduce that the infection was transferred to the other party. And then you had this extraordinary simulation where a little town called Hazelmere in south of England would propagate a pandemic across the United Kingdom into Northern Ireland. And it's more or less persuasive unless you understand that this is a digital virus. It's not a real virus.
Right.
So the criteria under which it's being transferred are purely in the world of cyberspace and artificial intelligence. And that might lull people into thinking, including, and I'm going to come to Event 201 in a minute, that this was a viable representation of how a virus actually spreads in the real world. Well, it's not. All right? Garbage in, garbage out.
Can I pause you there for a second, David, because this is important. And this is something that you and I have spoken about quite a lot. By putting this simulation of a viral pandemic on these cell phones, it's important that people understand we're not talking about a computer virus that's intended to compromise the security integrity of the phone. It's simply a piece of software that when it comes in close proximity with another phone that has that software, it transmits the marker that these two people have come in contact and the virus has been basically spread. And what I understand that you're telling us is that this simulation is not sufficiently realistic to give us acceptable results because there's far too many other parameters involved in determining if you actually get the virus from a carrier than just simply coming in close proximity with them. You would need to have perhaps a weakened immune system. You would need to touch something that they've touched. So this is a simulation that is not sufficiently sophisticated to give us accurate results. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. So I call that a template. There's a template of assumptions or parameters that are injected into algorithms developed by these mathematicians who are lovely people, I'm absolutely certain, but shaking my head, having come from something of an academic background, naive beyond belief, because what they've excluded, not intentionally, is the possibility of a criminal protection racket running behind the scenes. And now, why don't we just pop fast forward to Event 201,
Sure.
which was held at the Pierre Hotel on the 19th of October of last year, with some very interesting people, including some people who represented shareholders in SERCO and the Marriott hotel chain. So at Event 201, there was an interesting cast of characters, and they took, and I don't know what algorithms or what parameters or what template they use, but I do know that they were extremely simplistic algorithms, and actually fatally simplistic, because they again excluded the possibility of criminality behind that organization of the Event 201 in the Pierre Hotel. And I'm talking about the criminality of the shareholders, or potential criminality, of the shareholders of SERCO and the Marriott hotel chain. Now, there was an interesting woman that we've talked about, you and I, called Latoya Abbott. All right? Yeah, there she is. And her, let me just go so I don't make a mistake about what she is. She is the Senior Director of Global Occupational Health Services for Marriott Hotel, and she's worked in multiple jobs. But one of the things she did is streamline the vaccination of hospital employees against the flu. That was
hotel employees.
And hospital employees, because prior to joining Marriott International, she was the director of the Occupational Health and Wellness Institute at Providence Hospital in Washington, D.C., where she managed an occupational health clinic while treating patients, promoting wellness, and oversees workers' compensation. In this role, Dr. Abbott created and implemented a streamlined process to vaccinate hospital employees against the flu. Her innovative flu clinic led to a threefold increase in influenza vaccination rates among hospital workers. And I think she's doing the same thing now with Marriott Hotel for hotel employees. Now, if I wanted to stage, how shall I put it, a fake pandemic or a fake news pandemic in collaboration with SERCO that is in the business of what is known as resilience training for outfits, including the United Kingdom Cabinet Office, this is the woman I would go to. If I would say to her, I want to stage an event 201 in the Pierre Hotel in New York and get people's response to a digital or a virtual or an artificial reality pandemic where the virus is spread in ways consistent with what they accuse it to be in the event 201 from animal husbandry like pigs through to various parts of the world where it hops from an animal into a human, and that human becomes a patient zero. And patient zeros spread disease in a very characteristic way, perhaps somewhat efficiently simulated by the BBC Contagion exclamation mark.
Now, let me pause
if
you a
I want
second,
to-
David, because you've brought up a bunch of things, and I want to make sure we don't get too far ahead. People who haven't seen us before are going to learn that your knowledge is so vast and it's all at your fingertips. So I just want to go over a couple of things. We're looking at Dr. LaToya Abbott here on LinkedIn. And, you know, we've become very interested in this title, doctor. There are people who are rolling around the internet like Dr. Paul Cottrell, who are, you know, doctors of whatever that has nothing to do with medicine, but yet they present themselves without clearly enunciating their credentials. And I think it is incumbent on these people who present themselves as doctors, particularly when they're talking about this pandemic and offering people advice and insights, they got to let us know what they're all about. Now, is Dr. LaToya Abbott a medical doctor? It says that she is a nurse practitioner. When we look at her experience here, clinical nurse practitioner, occupational health services, are nurse practitioners referred to as doctor?
Well, I don't know what the protocol in America is.
Doctor of nursing practice. Yes, so that must be it.
Yes.
She's a doctor of nursing. So she's not an MD.
Yes.
But she's a doctor of nursing. And certainly nurse practitioners are very, very close to medical doctors. They can prescribe prescription drugs in the United States, as far as I know. So that's one good thing that we cleared up. And there was something else that you mentioned that I already forgot, but it'll come back to me later. So please carry on.
Okay, so this is a woman who can accelerate a vaccination program in a hospital, in a hotel, and presumably in a prison. And this intrigues me greatly because prisoners would be, I imagine, or prisons, a petri dish of these kind of infections if they are basically spread through a patient zero who comes into the prison, and proximity, because these prisoners spend, you know, years perhaps sharing a cell with another prisoner. And we know someone who did and ended up with his hyoid bone getting fractured, but maybe we don't need to go there. But my point is, if you wanted to spread or develop a vaccine, wouldn't it be interesting to develop a vaccine using viruses in prison blood, right? And that apparently is precisely what happened at the University of Arkansas Medical Services Center in the 1970s, where physicians were actually collecting prisoner blood. And about 1978, they handed that job over to the Arkansas Correction Health Management Agency. I think that was the term under the Clintons. And the Clintons, right up to the present, I suggest, have been in the tainted blood business. And of course, that has huge implications for the spread of HIV and AIDS and Hep C around the world, because the Arkansas prison system was generating blood at $7 a pint to the prisoners and selling it on to Connaught Laboratories in Montreal at $50 a pint, where it was turned into plasma and shipped around the world as it infected hundreds if not thousands, of people in Africa and veterans, as far as I understand, in the United States and in the United Kingdom and Canada. And I would allege that any party that was engaged in that in any way is actually should be charged through the civil courts with wrongful death. Because I'm not saying that Bill Gates or Bill Clinton intended to kill people, but through negligence or recklessness or willfulness or fraud, a lot of people died. And the classical remedy for that is a class action suit for damages. But I digress. So let's come back to the prison system. You remember we talked extensively about StarNet communications in Vancouver.
Ooh.
And it occurred to me.
You've reminded me of something, David. I've got something to share with you. Keep going.
Okay. So when in 1994 there was the last shipment of blood, tainted blood from the Arkansas prison system, I believe Bill Clinton needed to maintain what was essentially a criminal racket. That is to say, he needed access to tainted blood to continue, if not accelerate, the development of vaccines, so that certain selected groups, including elite gang leaders in prison, I mean, it's a hell of a way to control a prison, it could be threatened or offered the opportunity of being vaccinated against a virus that was being spread within the prison system. Now, that reminds me, I don't know if it does you, of Room 101 in BBC, right? Because Room 101 in BBC, which was an extraordinary operation because that was the fictional organization of 1984, right? And what happened in Room 101, someone could be tortured with their pet phobia. In the case of Winston, it was rats, right? So he was threatened, and I don't know whether he was actually done in 1984. Eric Blair, obviously the author, that was the original name, would propose that you would betray anyone if you were threatened with your phobia. And what Winston did, he betrayed his girlfriend, Julia, and said, or was basically provoked into saying, do it to her, and I'll do anything you want. Basically, Julia was threatened. Apparently, in the book, she had a scar on her face. I don't know whether she was threatened with rats. And this is, of course, a work of fiction. But basically, they both admitted to betraying each other and ultimately switched their loyalties, not to each other, but to Big Brother. Now, isn't that an interesting psychological experiment? Because I could imagine that in a jail cell or in the clinic within a jail, you could take even the most courageous, fearless gang leader and saying, look, it's time for your vaccination. And we got a vaccine that'll protect you against Hep C or AIDS or Ebola or something like that. It would be a great way of taking the loyalty of a gang leader to his or her fellow prisoners and transferring it to the organization that is capable of triggering a worldwide pandemic or protecting people within certain professions, within the jail system, within the hospital system, or within the hotel system against the said transfer of the virus. Apparently, coronavirus or COVID-19, it's a very nasty way to die because you basically, your lungs fill up with fluid, you get sort of double pneumonia, and you choke and you gasp, and you're supposed to go onto a ventilator. So what I think happened with SERCO, and SERCO runs a number of prison systems through the Five Eyes countries. SERCO pioneered the idea of attaching an ankle bracelet to prisoners, right? That was proposed by Tom Stacey of White's Club in 1983 at St. Erin's Hotel. And ultimately it was picked up. It was incorporated. I believe Assange had an ankle bracelet put on him when he was transferred by a SERCO van to, I believe he was put into Belmarsh jail, where he's festering right now, which is kitty corner to Thames Head prison, Her Majesty's prison, run by SERCO. So SERCO also installed the security systems in the Turnberry Trump Hotel in Scotland, which is interesting because I believe the Turnberry Trump Hotel was operated by the StarNet group, and StarNet was bought by Marriott Hotels. So
Now, wait
Marriott
a minute.
now has
StarNet? No.
sorry,
Starwood.
Starwood.
Yeah.
Correction.
But let's talk about StarNet for a second, David, because we do have a lot of new viewers with us who aren't familiar with some of the critical background. So StarNet Communications was this online gaming and pornography company that specialized in hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming. You and I visited the former location. I guess that was 2019. We were over there in downtown Vancouver, and we learned quite a bit about this symbol that's painted on the building at 425 Carroll Street. One of the locals there told us that this was a warning. And the thing that's interesting about it is that I've noticed both of these things elsewhere in the world. This raven that appears to have upside down 666 666 on its wings. And I mean, again, I'm not saying that I put significance on that. It's quite clearly there. And there are some people who do. One of the things I wanted to bring to your attention, David, is that there's a pretty new museum that's opened here in New York City. And I was walking by the other day. The thing is called like Photographica. I haven't been inside there, but they have got a flag dangling outside the building that is emblazoned with this logo. What does that look like to you, David?
Oh, it looks like the star, well, the mural on the side of that building, which is close to
seems like
StarNet.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's a warning to the people on the downtown east side. And you and I walked through it. Now, let me back up here. If they have developed a vaccine that can be pointed at hospital workers and hotel workers and prison workers, that would give them, when I say they, I believe I'm talking about SERCO and Marriott shareholders, which incidentally, I can shorten that up to S&M, which might be a euphemism for sadomasochism, but there we are, which is exactly what, incidentally, StarNet was into. Not just with adults. This is, I believe, a running sore in the soul of British Columbia and every Canadian, is that all of the kit that would have recorded evidence of hardcore adult and child pornography into 60 countries was confiscated on the 20th of August of 1999 by 100 law enforcement officers, including apparently a SWAT team from the IRS and the United States Customs Service. And it was taken somewhere. None of those directors of that company or employees have appeared in court. There've been no jail or convictions. So basically, this is a classic example of what is known as spoliation of evidence, where we, that is the American people, the Canadians, British, etc., we have a legitimate reason to accuse the people who took that evidence away of being guilty of hardcore adult and child pornography, including, I would allege, the collection of tainted blood from predominantly victims in the downtown east side who are prostitutes, who inevitably get STDs, etc. And if you wanted to maintain momentum on the development of the vaccines for this kind of blood, and you're shutting down the operation in Arkansas, courtesy of Bill Clinton's first administration, then what better place to go to is the red light districts where there are prostitutes, male, female, etc., drug taking, despair, unbelievable despair, you've seen it, right? And use that as a source of prison blood or tainted blood with which to develop vaccines that might protect people against COVID-19.
Now, David,
because
can I share
remember,
something
they are
with you
alleged.
here? Oh,
Yes.
sorry. So one of our viewers here in the chat, upon seeing the symbol there on StarNet Communications building, they're telling us that this is, well, I must agree. They say it looks like a thunderbird. And a thunderbird is a legendary creature in certain North American indigenous peoples, who are certainly the people who are living around there in the downtown east side of Vancouver. It is considered a supernatural being of power and strength. It's especially important and frequently depicted in the art, songs, and oral histories of many Pacific Northwest coast cultures, but it's also found in various forms among some people in the American Southwest. So I guess this is certainly counts as Northwest. We should look into more what the symbology of the Thunderbird means. But this is exactly what we're talking about, David, when it comes to crowdsourcing the truth. You and I had no idea what that thing was. It was just a weird symbol on the building. But the more we've looked at it and, sort of persisted in doing that, the more we're learning about it.
And that man on the sidewalk said it's a raven and it's a warning signal, right? No, maybe a thunderbird, maybe it's a raven. However, what I do believe is, with my cursory knowledge of the downtown east side, the people there are scared to death, Jason. Now, we walked along the sidewalk, if you recollect, and we saw people in close proximity. Now, what's interesting is, why isn't this pandemic virus spreading in the downtown east side or other red light districts around the world, right? It's because, I believe, that they've identified criminal super spreaders, right? That is to say, they've developed people in the prison system who can be deployed to target areas to carry the virus. And maybe, could you show that? I don't know if you got it to hand. You've got that image of the woman.
Sorry, take the audio down. But we've got this woman here in the Walmart who is just walking around. There's a woman waiting in line who's asking her, why is she touching all these laptops? It's interesting. She's opening them, she's closing them, she's touching all the keys, but she's not testing them out. She's just kind of wiping her hands across them. She's got this cup in her hand. We don't know what's on the cup. She's got some sort of, is it a note? Is it a cloth? What has she got there in that cup? And why would someone go touch every laptop like this? It would be consistent with someone wanting to spread some material on them. Could be someone spreading a virus. And if this woman were vaccinated against the virus, she's inoculated, but whoever comes in touch with it could get sick.
She's a super spreader, potentially. Now, that's why, I coined the name for a documentary that I think you and I are doing all the time. Every show we do what I would describe as Contagion 201, which is effectively a documentary of how a pandemic might start on a computer with artificial intelligence algorithms. So it simulates or creates the impression, in the case of Event 201, that this can cause 65 million dead people. And there are people talking into the camera using what I believe will prove to be a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals, right? And that is that BBC patent that we talked about. So Event 201, it's a very sophisticated operation which combines the injection of fake news and media plays that conditions the delegates, or maybe even frightens the delegates, is we're going to be arranging for a pandemic to break out that could kill 65 million people. What are you going to do about it? Would you like a vaccine? Would you like to be on the side that's actually spreading the virus? Or do you want to be a victim? Mm-hmm. Now, if we look at Professor Neil Ferguson at the Imperial College, he is the...
Is he a player in Event 201?
No, he isn't, but I think it's a good question. I think he helped put together the template for the Event 201 simulation with 65 million dead. So Neil Ferguson, obviously, all of these people are super bright. They are members of what Rockefeller would call, I think, an intellectual elite, mm-hmm. right? So he makes regular presentations to number 10 Downing Street. It turns out, I think on the 17th of March, he announced that he'd been infected or tested positive for COVID-19. And in his visits to number 10 Downing Street, which is the residence of the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson caught it. And then some members of his cabinet. So Boris Johnson self-isolated. Gregoire Trudeau, the wife of the Canadian Prime Minister, has been self-isolating. So has Trudeau. Isn't this an extraordinary message to be sent to national leaders? There's nothing sacred about your position. we can give you a load of the virus that make you sick, or ultimately, if we give you a bigger load, you're going to die. So you got a choice. This is like Room 101 on steroids, right? You can betray your country and live, or you can go down in flames, and no one will actually know that you betrayed your country. They'll commiserate with your nearest and dearest about the loss of a loved one.
Now,
So I
David,
think these people. Go
sorry,
ahead.
real quickly, a lot of reaction to that video of the woman in the Walmart. I should point out, and this is a fair point, someone has suggested that perhaps the woman is OCD. She may have an obsessive compulsive disorder that causes her to touch each of those computers. That's a reasonable thing to consider for sure. And I think it is important that we consider alternative possibilities, not just the ones that fit our hypothesis. And there's something that I need to bring up about Dr. Colleen Smith. I had posed the question to her if she had worked with or knew Bill Ayers, somebody that you and I speak about quite a bit and we'll be speaking about later today. I had made that inquiry based on Dr. Smith having attended the University of Chicago, but this was an error on my part because, of course, as you'll recall, David, Bill Ayers is on faculty at the University of Illinois in Chicago. So this is a different university, and I do apologize for that error. I want to thank the viewer that pointed that out. It still is an open-ended question. While she was in Chicago 20 years ago, in the academic circles of Chicago, did she ever encounter Bill Ayers? She certainly seems like she might be a Weather Underground type if she's involved in simulations. This is the doctor from the Ground Zero Hospital that's been featured in the New York Times. We're going to be talking about how the BBC has amplified this story. But Dr. Colleen Smith is the Associate Program Director of a medical simulation department at the Elmhurst Hospital Center. Looks like she might have changed this profile a little bit. She's a reconstructionista with interests in simulation. So yeah, she's been involved in lots of medical simulations. And the question that we all have is, this simulation fellow title, is she doing a simulation with regard to this COVID-19 pandemic? And if so, is this something that falls under the umbrella of the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act that came into law with the 2014 National Defense Authorization? So it could be legal what she's doing, but there's a lot of questions as to whether that's real or a simulation. And in part, David, your techniques and ideas have allowed us to really pose this question because I went there, and as you've always said, I checked the ground truth. We saw in the New York Times that it was an apocalypse, and when I went there, it didn't seem to reflect that because the line outside was not as big as it was when we saw the New York Times article, and it's quite a thing.
Well, I guess if you made a fictional film, and you called it The Missing Apocalypse, you're not going to put bums on seats, are you? Right? I mean, an apocalypse, like 2011, they come out with a film called Contagion. What is it? Nothing spreads like fear itself.
Right.
So there's a long pedigree of this creation of a simulated virus, whatever it is, right through to the present. Now, that doctor you mentioned, you might have asked her, did she meet Barack Obama at the University of Chicago?
I would like to ask her a lot of things, but she's refused to answer. One other thing I want to mention, David, this article used to come up right away when you just searched for New York Times and this doctor's name, but perhaps there's just been so much more reporting. Here it is. They've changed what was linking to it. But this is the article in the New York Times if people haven't seen it. Since the release of this article, it's now been stated that Dr. Smith has tested positive for coronavirus. I haven't done a lot of talking about this yet, David, but I've been in direct contact with the hospital. This morning at 10 a.m., we marked 48 hours since I was instructed to send my list of about 10 questions to the media department of the hospital. Those questions remain unanswered right now, and I'm pretty disappointed with the hospital. This is the New York Health and Hospital, so it's a public hospital. One thing I think that people will find interesting, when we look at the hospitals around the 5 boroughs of New York, it seems like there's basically these kind of, usually there's 3 points of contact. I'm sure there's more than 3 hospitals in Brooklyn and Manhattan. I mean, these are large boroughs. I don't know if there's only 3, but in Queens, there's only 2 phone numbers, and the media department number, look at the number, David. 334-3690. Now, I'm not sure what the significance of this is. We're not into numerology. We're just remarking that the number 33 seems to be a steganographic marker that is showing up all over the place with this coronavirus thing. And to the best of my knowledge, this 369 is somehow related to Nikola Tesla and the sacred geometry of the universe or something like this. We'll leave that to the viewers to ponder, but thank you for allowing me that little interjection.
Yeah, so it might be worthwhile, because I believe what we're looking at is, I mean, some people have mentioned to me anarcho-syndicalist, basically the destruction of society. But there's the implication of anarchy implies a disorder, a high entropy event, where everything gets destroyed. Whereas these events are highly structured, and they date back at least and beyond 9/11. Let's just remind people of who died on 9/11. And so lots of people know about 3,000 Americans died on 9/11, but they may not know that those Americans that died on 9/11 could have been broken up into classes based on their guilds or professions. That is to say, by virtue of being a firefighter, and of course, in the United Kingdom, in the City and Guilds of London, you have the Worshipful Company of Firefighters, which is a long-established trade or guild. There were 343 firefighters killed in a double ambush when the 2 towers came down, when they were demolished. There is no doubt in my mind, and although I didn't demolish buildings for a living, I've worked with explosives, certainly all my career in the oil industry, which was 15 years. There is no doubt in my mind those 2 buildings were demolished. But they were demolished, obviously, sequentially, and there were firefighters trapped in both buildings, and their communication systems didn't allow them to get the signal to get the hell out of the building, right? Then you take the world traders working for Cantor Fitzgerald, right, where, what's his name, Howard Lutnick, was very conveniently taking his child to school, and he was the chief executive officer of Cantor Fitzgerald. His brother and 657 or 684 of his colleagues were in the building, and none of them survived. That's a huge number. Now, these are world traders. I believe the throughput of Cantor Fitzgerald, which was the world's leading broker in government securities, Eurobonds, and sovereign debt, was something like $75 trillion a year. That's a lot of money flowing through the system. And bang, they're all dead. Now, what happened to that flow of money? It didn't stop. I can tell you that the backup computers cut in London to maintain that momentum, if you will. Go ahead.
Well, you've reminded me of something else critically important, David, and I don't think I've shared this with you yet. So yesterday when you and I were talking, people don't know that you and I have extensive conversations throughout the week, and we often come upon topics that I really want to make sure that I remember to bring up. So we were talking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and where it is located. And I found that it had, I'm not necessarily going back to exactly where I had it yesterday, but we found that it is, so this is one Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I'm not sure exactly where this is. This is a new one that I hadn't seen before. So this is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle, Washington. So we've got these kind of interesting buildings here. There is a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Washington, D.C. as well. So let's take a look at that. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Where's the one in Washington? See, the thing that was interesting to me about the one in Washington, D.C., David, is that we've also noticed that various places around the world, or specifically in the United States, this Google Earth is an interesting thing because people will notice as I move around the map, ordinarily, the buildings in Google Earth are displayed in 3D. I believe Google has a way of using photogrammetry to create 3D models of these buildings. It's interesting to note that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is located in a building in a part of Washington, D.C. that is considered too sensitive to be displayed in 3D. Chris Tanto Paranto had told me in an interview with him that he was very concerned about the sophistication of Google Earth because when he was stationed with his colleagues at the CIA outpost in Benghazi, Libya, he felt that terrorists were able to use Google Earth and some of these extremely accurate parameters to set off mortars with amazing precision. The thing that I wanted to show you about this Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, however, David, is that they also have an office in the City of London.
Yeah, well, this goes wide and deep. Now, let's just return to the idea that the shareholders of SERCO and Marriott Hotel, which include BlackRock Inc., which is the world's largest shadow banker with about $6.3 trillion of assets under management, whose CEO is a guy called Larry Fink, who is a member of Kappa Beta Phi, in that Wall Street chapter of Kappa Beta Phi. And it's, you stop me if I'm going off on a tangent there, but I think it's important to tell the audience, particularly the new ones, that we've identified, I think you and I both agree on this, a very powerful organization, which is a pair of secret societies that were launched in 1776, which was obviously a pivotal year for the new republic, if I might say. So they're called Phi Beta Kappa and Kappa Beta Phi. Phi Beta Kappa today has 17 presidents, 30 Supreme Court judges, and 120 Nobel Prize winners. So that would fit the bill of David Rockefeller's point that the world is ready to move to a supranational government of an intellectual elite and international bankers. And on Wall Street, the only surviving chapter, and it was established in 1929, which is a pivotal year, of Kappa Beta Phi, includes members such as Larry Fink, Michael Bloomberg, and Wilbur Ross. So,
well, sorry, I'm behind you with the graphics. We should clear this up for people. There's Phi Beta Kappa, which is this highly respected intellectual academic society, which has some questionable members of its own. And then there's Kappa Beta Phi, which is the Wall Street, secret society. And you and I have speculated, David, and our audience has considered this as well, that these are essentially two sides of the same coin.
Yes, probably controlled by British intelligence, because 1776 was a pivotal year. I think the British, who are no dummies when it comes to running an empire, decided there's no point on taking on these pesky American colonists who hide behind the trees, and they hide themselves in clothes that don't show up. Like the British marched around in red coats, and you could see them from miles away. So from a sniper's point of view, they were on a hiding to nothing. So it's much better to create a secret society and make sure through the initiation ceremonies or oath swearing ceremonies of the members of that secret society that they get privileges, but they get obligations because someone has witnessed them, I'm saying hypothetically, doing something of the type that was apparently done at Starnet Communications with its hardcore adult and child pornography operations. But that would be a very good way from entrapping people, sexual entrapment, a honeypot, and then blackmailing them into, supporting whatever was on the agenda. Well, when David Rockefeller, I think he was at either a Bilderberg conference or a World Economic Conference, which I believe was one of the hosts of the Event 201 in New York, he said, the world is ready. Oh, let me back up here. We are grateful for the discretion of our great publications including the New York Times and the Washington Post, who would otherwise have revealed our plans for a world government, right? Something to that effect. And this world government would be a supranational government of an intellectual elite, which I think is identified with Phi Beta Kappa, and international bankers, which would be equivalent to Kappa Beta Phi. Now, at that meeting of SERCO shareholders on the 47th floor, there were shareholders there that included representatives of the two big educators teachers fund, pension fund. That would be TIAA, Teachers Insurance Annuity Association, which I believe is the world's largest private pension fund, and the University Superannuation Scheme, which represents the equivalent in the United Kingdom. Now, the Guild of Educators was formed in 2001, the same year as the Guild of International Bankers. As far as the international bankers are concerned, and shareholders of SERCO, that includes 10 global custodians and BlackRock Inc., the world's largest shadow banker, which represents assets under management of over $100 trillion. So on 9/11, the shareholders of SERCO met on the 47th floor. To my knowledge, not one of the representatives of those shareholders has been hauled before the FBI and asked what the hell they were doing on the 47th floor. They all walked out of the building after being addressed by Mr. Christopher Hyman, who at that time was the chief executive officer of SERCO, and he was at a meeting at the windows of the World Restaurant, a breakfast meeting with the Risk Waters Group. Around 8:30, 9/11 folks, he gets up from his breakfast meeting and he gets into the elevator and he goes down to the 47th floor, leaving everyone behind him to fry. The legitimate question is, what the hell did he know and when did he know it?
There's another thing I want to introduce at this point, David, because we're talking about the New York Times. David Rockefeller directly thanked the New York Times. We've got Dr. Colleen Smith appearing in the New York Times. And so now we come to 9/11, and I want to remind people about this article, which appeared in the New York Times on September 11th, 2001. You rightly point out that the first plane hit the World Trade Center, I think 8 a.m., 8:04 a.m., 8:40 a.m., something like that.
8:46.
8:46. So certainly the New York Times for September 11th, 2001 is printed and distributed prior to 8:46 a.m. So this article about Bill Ayers, one of the founders of the Weather Underground, which if people are not familiar with that terrorist organization, they should go back into the archives of David Hawkins Discovery CSI and check out all the shows that we've created talking about this sinister organization. But it's very strange to me that on September 11th, they would post an article about this subversive, anarchistic, socialist, Marxist who wanted to destroy the United States government, whose organization bombed the Pentagon, bombed the NYPD headquarters. His now wife, who was the co-founder of the organization, issued an audio recording of a manifesto warning Americans to guard their universities, guard their banks, guard their airplanes. And of course, everyone knows airplanes were used on 9/11. I reject the nonsensical theory that holograms were used. You and I agree that something other than an airplane hit the Pentagon. And you and I also don't talk very much about Shanksville, but with regard to the World Trade Center, I think airplanes were used. And this article appearing on September 11th, in which Mr. Ayers says, "I don't regret setting off bombs. I feel like we didn't do enough." So is he perhaps nodding or giving a tip of the hat, saying that here comes the next wave? Certainly September 11th could have resulted in the absolute overthrow of the United States military, the United States government. You look frozen there, David. I hope you're back with us. While we're waiting for David to come back, I want to thank John Doe for utilizing Super Chat on Crowdsource the Truth 2. Viewers on Crowdsource the Truth 2 should check out the phone call that I had with Dr. Paul Cottrell. Are you back with us, David? The picture looks frozen. There we go.
So, can you hear me, Jason?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So Bill Ayers is an interesting character, but he's way down the pecking order of the organization that put 911 together. But of course, he is an educator at the University of Illinois, Chicago, right? His wife, Bernadine Dawn, who's a psychopath, is an educator on faculty at Northwestern University. Interestingly, as a quick riff, Northwestern University had a patent for a detoxification system that included detoxification for Novichok, the nerve agent, which is interesting because of the attack in Salisbury. So when people were rushing around trying to identify the source of the Novichok, I warned them, but it would actually been very interesting. Now, what's that background on?
Well, this we've looked at before.
Oh.
This is very similar to the symbol on StarNet Communications, and it's curious that you just mentioned that you warned people, because this looks to me like Bernadine Dorn standing there with something that is substantially close to the warning painted below the Thunderbird on 425 Carroll Street.
Right, and they are using, I think, because their colleagues and many of their friends ended up in jail. I think once you're in jail, you are very vulnerable to the kind of Room 101 extortion, perhaps perfected in fiction in 1984, but in reality with a vaccination program that might have been introduced by Christine Marcy, who was the de facto founder of the Federal Marshal's prisoner transportation system, I think around 1984, 1986, when she bought a Boeing 727. And that morphed with the Bureau of Prisons prisoner transportation system into what was known as JPATS. In 1994, JPAT's nickname is Con Air, right? So these people would be in a very powerful position to deploy vaccinated or unvaccinated prisoners on parole and track them through crime scenes using one of the patents that I've identified in my template, which is the Jerome Lemelson patent for tracking prisoners, or warning of tracking and prisoners and parolees using some combination of artificial intelligence algorithms or fuzzy logic algorithms or expert system algorithms, in which I'm an expert. So what I've tried to do with my patent template, I've identified 10 patents that I believe placed in the hands of the conspirators that I allege met at Event 201 in the Pierre Hotel in New York on the 19th of October. The conspirators could use some combination of those patents, and I'll talk about the last one because I think that's particularly fascinating, is to arrange for a pandemic to switch from simulation to real and back again, so the public is totally confused about what's real and what's fake. Where the service that you and I, and particularly you, have brought, I think, to the public at large, potentially a global audience, is it's absolutely vital to ground truth the data that is being generated through these simulations. Now, at that conference, it was co-hosted by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Johns Hopkins University, and I think the World Economic Conference, is it? Or Council?
Maybe Forum?
Sorry?
World Economic Forum?
Whatever. That was co-hosted. They had basically a script that I believe had been prepared on the equivalent of what the BBC calls a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. And that patent was taken out by the BBC, I think, on the 3rd of August of 1998, 4 days before my birthday, and 4 days before the attack on the United States East African Embassy building in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, which killed lots of Americans, which of course is exactly what Mr. Ayers and his psychopathic wife love to do. They like
Well,
to kill
can we
Americans.
address that for a second? Because that's quite important,
Sure,
I
sure.
think, David. They
Yeah.
had their stated manifesto, which, as I understand it, included re-educating Americans. So they wanted to infiltrate the university system. And you've spoken extensively about various elements of corruption in Chicago, but they wanted to infiltrate the university system, and they wanted to overthrow the federal government, the United States government, change the nature of the government, and they felt that there would be between 25 and 35 million people who would not be able to be re-educated, and they would need to be eliminated. And I think it's important that we touch on, the title of today's episode. We spoke about how patented fake news could be leading to this pandemic. Can I direct you towards this document for a moment, David? Because I've had a real difficult time finding this. We used to just bring it up off the internet almost every week, and I think it's been removed. Luckily, I had a copy downloaded, but I'm sure you recognize this document, right?
Absolutely.
So what do we want to say about this?
Did you want me to comment on it? Yeah, sure.
Please.
So if you go through the text of that, apparently SERCO runs the Emergency Preparedness Council or College, right? And it operates under this label of resilience. And resilience is where SERCO, which is a private company, controlled effectively, I would say, by the Educators Pension Fund and the international bankers with $100 trillion of assets under management. SERCO educates, for example, members of the UK Cabinet Office on how to respond to, well, let's say a pandemic. So Boris Johnson, who has no, let me be really snobby, if I will, about education at Oxford as opposed to Cambridge, right? At Oxford, you can get a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. At Cambridge, of course, I presume you can get a degree at Oxford in engineering, but at Cambridge, I think we had a unique and extraordinary reputation in terms of engineering. Now, I happen to have blown up a diesel engine in the laboratory at Cambridge, but because I'm not too practical, but I'm very good theoretically, and there were explanations and some extenuating circumstances, but I'm lucky not to have died. But the grounding of ground truth, if you will, is basically the preserve of engineers and practical people, right? When you do philosophy, politics, and economics, I think you can live quite happily with simulation as a kind of a proxy for reality. No, thank you. That's it. I got my hat. I was asking someone the other day whether I should wear my hat at these interviews, and they said it was too in your face.
Good
but that's okay.
when we came back from the trip, but I don't think it's necessary
Yes.
all the time.
And and it says, founded. It's the University of Cambridge, founded, I think, 1347. So we have a certain pedigree. But by the by, what's extraordinary is the dichotomy, if you will, between the politicians who go through Oxford University and become key players in government, and many of them do, and engineers who go through Cambridge University and are basically equipped by their training to ground truth simulations, right? And when I was working in Schlumberger in artificial intelligence, I made a major advance in interpreting oil field data, because what I noticed is geologists, petrophysicists, geophysicists, reservoir engineers, with their particular background, they would bring a different interpretation technique to the same set of data, and their interpretations would disagree. So I invented and developed and refined and perfected a method of reconciling the different opinions of the specialists in the oil industry. When you come to a crime scene, of course, you have biologists, you have doctors, you have forensic engineers, if you will. They all disagree about the crime scene. Have I lost you because you're not moving?
No, I'm taking out these porn bots here.
Oh, okay, all right.
Let's just talk about that for a second, David. I don't want to give them too much attention, but what happens is when we do important shows, they try to overwhelm the message with nonsense. And this is, part of what I'm talking about with these social engineers. They're really annoying and they won't give up.
Well, interesting you should talk about that, because going back to my template, One of the patents is the kinetic patent for social engineering protection appliance, which
Yes.
on the internet sorts through the kind of material you just mentioned and perhaps graduates or elevates that to the truth or something important for people to know about. And the kind of stuff that you and I do, that would be deemed through the computer, I believe, to be objectionable because it flies against
The narrative.
narrative, if you will, that the governments want you to promote. And I think we need to be very careful here. I don't think the government is 99% corrupt. I think the great majority of people working in your Senate, your Congress, your different arms of the government, I think they're trying to do the right job, but they're not being given the picture that I think Thomas Jefferson said an informed public will make the right decision. The
Right.
American public, the British public, the Australian, the New Zealand, and the Canadian, members of the Five Eyes countries, which was probably the greatest surveillance and intelligence network the world has ever seen, and possibly continues to this day, has been hacked and it is totally compromised, right?
Hmm.
And many of the people who are doing the right thing, including in the FBI, or trying to do the right thing, FBI, RCMP up here in Vancouver with that raid on Starnet, right? They would be horrified if we could show them, and I think we're well on the way to doing it, what the big picture is and how they're being led by the nose into or through a conspiracy that I think, in the words of J. Edgar Hoover, he said, the individual is handicapped by coming face to face by a conspiracy so monstrous they cannot believe it exists. Now, here's a theory I just developed this morning.
Hmm.
What if that attack in Wuhan City was a decoy where they could sacrifice a few Chinese lives, right? But make it look like the infection or the pandemic started in Wuhan City and is now spreading around the world, and the real target was the United States and the United Kingdom. Because if you look at the BBC's production of people dying or infected, where they appear to be attached to the Johns Hopkins University simulator, they're indicating that whilst the pandemic started in Wuhan City and there were lots of persuasive deaths which might persuade people that the source was in Wuhan City, it's now spread into the United States, which has more deaths and more infections than China ever did. Now, what happens if that was the original purpose? Remember Bill Ayers, he wants to destroy your country, right? And I've just introduced, we had talked about it briefly before, the idea of guild socialism, which I believe it's basically the idea that the guilds working on the production of any particular service should own the means of production. So it's a kind of communism on steroids, if you will. So let's just go back to 911. What always strikes me as odd, 343 dead firefighters, right? 685 or 58 dead world traders at Cantor Fitzgerald, about 200 to 300 insurers at Aon Corporation and Marsh McLennan, 60 members of the New York Port Authority, police department dead. Those are huge and massive, professionally specific or targeted deaths, right? If that were truly random, you wouldn't have 658 world traders working for Cantor Fitzgerald, the world's largest broker in sovereign debt, Eurobonds, and US government securities, killed because effectively that, if that's the right term, emasculated Cantor Fitzgerald as an entity, and the business appears to have been transferred to the City of London. Aon Corporation, headquarters which were in Chicago, is now in London. So just think, the worshipful company of insurers could have been penetrated, and I believe has been penetrated, by criminal organizations. And what started, well, in the case of the Mercers, that's the oldest livery company in the City and Guilds.
What is a Mercer again? They're making wool?
Well, importer of fabrics and silks and et cetera, 14th century. So the aristocrats got hold of the best kind of materials to put on their fancy robes. You know, it's pretty spectacular what they dressed in, and that was differentiated them from the peasants that used, I don't know, rough wool. Basically, it must have itched like crazy. But anyway, that distinguished these people, and they served the aristocracy. Now, interestingly, I've been writing open letters. I don't direct them. I don't direct them straight at him, but it can be found on my site, to Sir David Clementi, right? And he is the chairman of the BBC board, right, which governs, for example, the next election or selection of a director general, because Tony Hale has announced that he's resigning.
Where can people
Now,
find those, David? On reversecciscripts.com?
well, they could find that on Patreon, my Patreon account,
perfect.
right? In the posts, which I call now. I used to call the storyboards the graphic that I used to show you,
Right.
but I found that the graphic that it took me a lot of time to put together, which showed the patterns and the personalities, was too static in a fast-changing world like this pandemic. So I now use my text and the images in the Patreon account to do what I believe a storyboard does for a film. It's a pot shot of a narrative, right, that I think the people can get around. So now going back to the BBC, on the 4th of August or 3rd of August in 1998, they filed a patent application for a spoken text display apparatus for the generation of television signals. What I think you and I have done now is say those television signals are what you would have called in the 19th century blocking notes. They are instructions to a particular group of people to carry out some function that contributes to the production of a documentary or a news broadcast, etc., etc. And it might include a message to environmental cleaners, for example, to start cleaning up the debris on the Pentagon lawn about 10 minutes after the Pentagon was impacted. Now, I would say that those environmental cleaners, and you've shown pictures of that multiple times, that are taking evidence from the Pentagon lawn, they may not know that they're engaged in a spoliation felony, right? Because the evidence on the Pentagon lawn should have been preserved with a chain of custody.
Right.
When they take it away, it means Americans cannot say what didn't hit the Pentagon, right? So that's left to people like me, an engineer, who can do a vector analysis of, is it possible for a large passenger jet to do a tight pivoted descending turn of 270 degrees in 3 minutes from 7,000 feet, leveling off 15 feet above the Pentagon lawn and flying into the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center at 500 miles an hour? And the answer is no, it can't do it. That's a vector analysis. So when you see those people removing evidence on the Pentagon lawn, what they're removing is evidence that it wasn't a large passenger jet that did that maneuver, because physically a large passenger jet could not do that maneuver because you get what is called ground air turbulence.
Well, and not only that, David, I've been in communication with another one of our pilot friends, Willem, just randomly this morning. You know, people all over the world want to know what's going on in New York. So I've been getting back in touch with a lot of people. It's not only the proximity to the ground that was unrealistic, but there's a radar path that shows Pentagon radar 9/11. That's interesting. It's not showing it to us right now, but the thing makes a corkscrew turn that multiple pilots have told me is way beyond the performance envelope of a 767 or a passenger jet. For some reason, I'm not seeing that radar data now.
Right. So, well, what I think, whatever it was that hit the Pentagon was flying through imputed waypoints, I think downloaded or imputed by another one of the patents that I've got on my 10 patent list for the template. Now, I think it's just worth touching on the number 10 of that patent, which I describe as the sneak. And this is the one that I believe Hillary Clinton was involved in, because what you can do with the BlackBerry, and I believe what Phantom Secure did, which was based in Richmond, British Columbia, just around the corner from McDonnell Detweiler, which I believe built the decoy and drone software for the 911 attack.
Wow.
What you can do, and you've looked at that, is you can take out the guts of the BlackBerry and convert it theoretically to something that is secure. And it appears, I believe, perhaps you can support that, that Hillary Clinton was equipped with one or more of those BlackBerries that would have put her in contact in real time with a criminal organization with 20,000 users around the world, engaged in pornography, money laundering, and drug trafficking, and murder for hire. Unfortunately for the Five Eyes countries, the head of intelligence for the Canadian RCMP, a guy called Cameron Ortis, is now in jail because it was found he was using this technology to communicate with criminal groups around the world. And that's kind of important from the Five Eyes countries because that implies that top secret information for operations in Afghanistan or Iraq or in China or Wuhan, for example, were being leaked to criminal organizations, some of whose leaders would be in jail. So my question to Americans is, how do you control a criminal organization that straddles the globe, where many of its leaders are actually in jail with a nearly perfect alibi, but have advanced communications with the outside world through what I call the Clinton Phantom Scab network, right? Where Scab stands for Starnet, the Kappa elite, the two Phi Beta Kappa and Kappa, and AMEC and Bovis. Now, what amazes me, and I'm coming to President Donald Trump now, who I think would, like many of us, certainly in that position, could be extremely vulnerable to blackmail. Because if the hotels that he has got his name with were built by one of these organizations that has installed the Phantom Scab network, i.e. Bovis, then all of the Trump's guests and employees could be surveilled and tracked through the hotel and potentially entrapped and ultimately blackmailed. And unfortunately for President Trump, I believe, and his businesses, Bovis built the Trump Hotel in Chicago and the Trump Soho Hotel in New York. And SERCO provided security for the Turnberry Trump Hotel in Scotland. So I would say the command and control and communications of the Trump Hotel network, just like I believe the Marriott Hotel network, and in some cases I believe Marriott staffs and manages the hotels for the Trump name, you got a situation where the hotels could be the method by which you vector in specialist criminal groups into crime scenes like 911. So then let's back up and see what hotels would actually have able to eyeball the crime scene. Well, you have the Marriott Hotel in the World Trade Center, right, which is sometimes known as the 911 Hotel, because someone has made a documentary on the Marriott Hotel in New York about how some of the guests survived and some perished, etc. But the Marriott Hotel was basically destroyed.
Yeah.
Then you have in the hotel in overlooking the Pentagon's U.S. Navy Command Center, you have the Pentagon City Hotel run by Sheraton and therefore Starwood. And Starwood has been bought into the Marriott Group. In Dubai, which I believe was sending the telemetry signals to the weapons on 911, you have the Dubai Creek Sheraton Hotel, right, which is near where I used to live because I lived 3 years in Dubai, had a wonderful time traveling around the Middle East, made many friends in the different countries I visited. And then in Port Douglas in Queensland,
Oh, yeah.
you have the Sheraton Millennium Hotel, is it? I don't know, where Bill Clinton was staying. Now, if all of these networks are synchronized to the National Physical Laboratory clock in Teddington in Middlesex, and with military operations around the world, you have to have them on the same time. You don't want pilots flying from one time zone to another and saying, am I in Pacific Standard Time or Central Time or Mountain Time? etc., etc. They get what is called universal time or Zulu time from the cesium fountain clock that was outsourced to SERCO in 1994 through the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington in Middlesex. So this company, SERCO, and its shareholders would have had the opportunity to synchronize all of those different guilds moving into targets on 911, together with the environmental cleaners who would be deployed in good faith, I believe, to take evidence away. So I mentioned AMEC, which had the floors above Starnet at 425 Carroll Street. AMEC had the contract as prime contractor, and they would have got that from the Bill Clinton era, to do the upgrades for Wedge 1 in the Pentagon's US Navy Command Center. It also got the contract to take the debris away. AMEC got the job of upgrading the diesel systems in building number 7, and also got the contract with Bovis of taking the evidence away of what really hit the Twin Towers, killed 343 firefighters in a double ambush, a sequential ambush, and then demolished building number 7, which I believe had the installation of the Clinton Phantom scab network linked to the Marriott Hotel at the base of the Twin Trade Center. So you have a hotel prison-based criminal network using the most advanced technology to coordinate the attempted overthrow of the government of the United States on 911. Over to you.
It's fascinating stuff, David. People who are watching the show for months and years are going to recognize that some of this is being reiterated, but I always am getting more and more out of it when people can contemplate these details and go back over this ground again. I think it's a very good way for people to understand what we're talking about. And it's just astounding, David, how many of these things that you've told us about for so many years are coming into play. There's a big question right now if this thing happening in Elmhurst Hospital is a simulation. The doctor featured in the New York Times is a simulation expert. I want to take you for a second back to some more of the language from this gold standard document. This is the SERCO. This is basically an advertising brochure for SERCO's combined resilience exercising. Now, where's the language in here, David, where it says that it involves, well, first let's look at this. Exercise development involves workshop exercises designed to assist with plan development. Well, this is what they're telling us Event 201 is, right? It's a tabletop exercise designed to develop teamwork and validate plans. So they've invited everybody there from the CDC, from the Marriott hotels, from the various companies that are going to supply medical equipment and all that kind of thing. So it's that. Full-scale rehearsals of operations or coordination centers at all levels of command. I don't know what that means, but integration of live exercise play. Well, I can't tell you, David, how many people have sent me this Mike Pompeo clip where he's talking about we are in the midst of a live exercise. Have you seen this, David?
No.
He says, we're in the midst of a live exercise. Here, we'll play the clip. No, I guess the audio is not, sorry, hang on a second. Let's see if I can make this work here.
Against our scientists,
mental stress for Winston.
This is not
So
about
he was.
Whoop. We had another clip of you back there. It's tricky to get audio going on the computer. Hang on, let me kill this.
We need to make sure that even today, the data sets that are available to every country, including data sets that are available.
Now we're in an exercise? I thought there was a full-blown pandemic.
I'm going to find it right where he says it.
You may have listened to this video already, but I want you to listen live extra. Hear it?
Going forward, we're in a live exercise here to get this right.
So what's he talking about, David? He says we're in a live exercise. SERCO is telling us that their gold standard resilience training involves the integration of live exercises. The types of exercises are workshop exercises, tabletop exercises, live exercises, command, control, post exercises. I mean, does this explain the number of strategic operations groups I've seen around the city from the NYPD? These live exercises can range from testing individual components of a system or organization through to a full-scale rehearsal. They're particularly useful when there are regulatory requirements or with high-risk situations. They're more complex and costly to organize and deliver, but they can be integrated with command post exercises. I mean, a lot of this is language that most people aren't going to be familiar with, but it does talk about simulation and media support. So this sounds like, to some extent, what Dr. Colleen Smith is involved in. The method of delivering an exercise is flexible, and it'll be designed with the client to meet their requirements, with options ranging from simple paper-based delivery through to the full use of their real communication systems, advanced computer simulation. And in addition, media play can also be added in the form of news injects. So is this the New York Times? We've got news injects happening. You've also brought to my attention this Vanity Fair article, where is it here, that is basically telling us the same kind of things that the New York Times told us. This also goes on to say that the BBC was providing news feeds to around the world, and it says prominent media figures have been calling for more coverage inside hospitals. Now, this was a major beef that we had. It seemed quite strange that Dr. Colleen Smith was able to record video inside the hospital, and they wanted to come especially from TV outlets, the BBC, Sky News. You and I were discussing this pretty odd situation where there was an operating room or some ER that was the same in Italy and New York. It was quite obviously fake news because we could not have the same ER in both Italy and New York, but yet CBS News has been embroiled in a scandal based on them using the same footage. They've been caught essentially red-handed, stirring panic with this coronavirus outbreak. For some reason, I'm having a difficult time finding this now. Perhaps it's been scrubbed.
Well, I think really what we're getting very close to, and let me just reiterate, my last post, I talked about are the SERCO and Marriott shareholders liable for, and I know I tend to use a bit of jargon here, but just bear with me, vectored Conair COVID LARP. Now, Conair is the nickname of the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System that Bill Clinton's organization, I believe, driven by Christine Marcy, created out of the Federal Marshal's Prisoner Transportation System of the 1980s or 84 period, and the Bureau of Prisons Prisoner Transportation System. They put the two together, called it the United States Justice Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, nicknamed Conair, and that became part of a film, right? I think it was a 1997 film, quite a successful film. And Christine Marcy, who was the head of the detention and deportation program of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and senior counsel for the marshals, she was interviewed that, and she said, our prisoners don't kick or spit. Well, you wouldn't kick or spit, would you, if you were told, look, if you misbehave, we're going to vaccinate you, and the vaccine might work to protect you from homosexual sex from your cellmate, or it might actually trigger an HIV reaction in you, right?
David.
Even the bravest, go ahead.
We've got a very interesting comment here from Who Hears. I don't know if this is true or false, but Who Hears tells us that a virus has to have two keys to enter and infect the cell. That's fascinating if true, because we've speculated about that someone could introduce one component and then threaten to introduce the other. I do want to thank John Doe for utilizing Super Chat on Crowdsource the Truth too. I would also like to take this opportunity, David, to remind everybody who's watching us right now that David Hawkins Discovery CSI is normally a sponsor-exclusive program that's only available to sponsors either of David's Patreon site or sponsors of Crowdsource the Truth. So starting next week, people can see the show in its sponsor-exclusive format. Please go to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards to sponsor David, and to sponsor Crowdsource the Truth, people can go to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth or subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. And they can watch all of the archived episodes, dig into some of the material that we're talking about here. And we've got a lot of new viewers, David. We've got over 1,000 people watching us right now. And I think people are quite fascinated by some of the topics that you're sharing. I also wanted to point out on this U.S. Marshal Service website, the U.S. Marshals, they're charged with protecting prisoners and transporting them to and from court and jails and things like that. But I mean, you know, they're a component of the United States law enforcement apparatus. And I've always found it very strange that their website has this section on business opportunities. Like, you can hire them to do stuff, which is weird. I don't think that the FBI is advertising business opportunities and providing you with, people to call to like make them offers. Isn't that weird?
Well, totally. And going back to Christine Marcio, I think was the eminence grise for JPATS or Con Air. Apparently she flunked her medical exam. She wanted to be a doctor, but she has about a year of medical training and is allegedly credited with introducing a prisoner medical services program. Well, if I'm a prisoner and she's administering a service to me, I'm kind of going to be a bit spooked out here. But do you remember there is a name of a famous Phi Beta Kappa member who did a year of medical school before flunking out in the 19th century?
Who is that?
Jane Addams.
Ah, yes, of course.
Now, I think listeners should be highly intrigued by this. In 1888, there were a series of canonical murders in the Whitechapel area of London, where women were disemboweled and cut up. And I think one of the names on my reverse CSI script map is Jane Ann Kelly, or Mary Ann Kelly, who was the last of the canonical murders. Could you zoom in on the top right of the clock? And I think maybe I'm getting her name wrong.
There it is, Mary Jane Kelly.
There it is. So she died in 1888, and the name beside her is Andrea Josbury. So just a little for the sleuths amongst us, and I hope we attract a new form of forensic inquiry amongst our audience, where you connect the dots and do what Sherlock Holmes said. There are many people in this world who, given a series of events, will tell you what comes to pass. There are very few, given an event, will tell you the circumstances led up to it. Right. So I look at Mary Jane Kelly, who was practically decapitated in 1888 by the alleged Jack the Ripper, and Anna Josbury, whose skull was found in a fridge out at the pig farm, right? With it looks like a chainsaw that had gone through her skull to make room for a foot and a hand. Now, this is gory beyond belief, but the level of gratuitous cruelty or brutality on both women, it spans 100 years. So I'm interested by, is there an organization, or a couple of secret societies, let's say, that in their initiation ceremony or oath-taking ceremony, they get individuals to take an oath that is witnessed or recorded on a film that basically allows the custodians of those films to control that individual for the rest of their careers. And I think I'm ready to allege that the Clintons are probably very attractive targets to be entrapped, because my understanding of Bill Clinton's career at Oxford University, he did 1 year of philosophy, politics, and economics.
Well, David, connection interrupted.
Okay, my back up?
Yes, Bill Clinton did 1 year of philosophy at Oxford.
At Oxford University. Yeah, philosophy, politics, and economics. And my understanding, he was kicked out, accused of rape and dealing in drugs. Where did he go to? He didn't go back to the United States. He went to Moscow, presumably to, I don't know, debrief the KGB on how to interrogate John McCain at the Hanoi Hilton. And then he comes back. He crossed a picket line of educators, I believe, in 1972 with his wife or girlfriend. I don't know when he married then, Hillary Clinton. Mm-hmm. And then they began a career, or they went on to faculty at the University of Arkansas, where Bill Clinton taught constitutional law and Hillary Clinton taught criminal law. And that's interesting because about the end of that period, the physicians at the university, okay, sorry. Are we still in contact?
Yeah. I'm just. There's, sometimes I have to deal with ejecting people from the chat.
Okay, so someone made a decision to take the obligations of physicians at the University of Arkansas Medical Services Center, where they were collecting prisoner blood for whatever purpose, I can't imagine, and transfer it to Bill Clinton's cronies in the Health Management Association in Arkansas, where they turned it into a mega business, a global mega business, collected tainted blood, turning it into a plasma in Canada and shipping it off to Africa, where it killed or infected hundreds of thousands of people. So what happened to that tainted blood business model? I think it developed into a vaccine virus combination. I think you might have had one of your listeners just call in about a two aspect. They might have created a binary weapon here, Jason, that has vaccine elements to it and viral elements to it. And by varying the ratio of those two, you can get an effect, which might be a full-blown pandemic or protection against mumps and measles in the prison system. That's an extraordinarily powerful weapon. I guess it would be classified as chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons of mass destruction, because you could kill, as was modeled at 201, 65 million people.
But David, let me ask you this. Is it a medically supported theory to presume that you can have something that is a combination of a virus and a vaccine? I'm not sure if I am really satisfied by that hypothesis. How about the idea that they have, like in that case of the woman in Walmart? So now we have a piece of video evidence. What does it indicate? It indicates that a woman is, walking around Walmart touching every computer. It could be a coincidence that this is a Chinese woman, or it could be evidence that's supportive of this notion that there are some people who are going around deliberately spreading a virus. This would be a way to do it. So I kind of think it's a maybe stronger hypothesis to just presume that they've got a virus that they have a vaccine for. And if the vaccine were classified and nobody knew they had the vaccine, this woman could be vaccinated and be rubbing COVID-19 all over computers where, if a dozen people come into this Walmart and get sick wherever the Walmart is, and suddenly there's a hot spot in this city, that's a way to spread it.
I think you just nailed it with that language, you see, because coming back to my background in artificial intelligence in the 1980s, where I worked as a coordinator of AI and geoscience research for Schlumberger, I developed a ground truthing technique to test hypotheses like the one you just mentioned. We can hypothesize. It's perfectly legitimate to hypothesize that this woman has been given a job to, disinfect these, because I now go to my local grocery place. And
but she's not working for Walmart. She's got no disinfectant with her. She's got a drink in her hand and she's just rubbing.
Yeah, you're jumping ahead. But all I'm saying is what you need with the template is the ability to hypothesize right across the board, including, is there a binary weapon made up of vaccine and viral elements that can be, where that ratio can be adjusted to give you the effects you observe?
Now I understand. So
Right?
you're saying it's binary in that the weapon is the collection of the biological element and those that are
Right.
disseminating it. And if you are a vaccinated person, you become part of this overall system where some of it is vaccinated and some of it is viral. See, it's important to listen to David Hawkins very closely and perhaps to listen again and to tune in every week and to become a sponsor on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboard and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. Because David, what we're experiencing right now is, aside from the COVID-19 situation, so many of the things that you've spoken about are actually coming into play in the real world. And so we're basically ground truthing your theories.
Yeah, and you see, that's just like Sherlock Holmes said, there are many people in life who, given a series of events, will tell you what comes to pass. So at event 201, there's a whole bunch of people, I assume well-meaning, who are told, if this happens and this happens and this happens, we might have 65 million dead, right? But equally, if you go backwards and suddenly discover that what they said in the simulation might happen is actually happening, then you need to go back down the food chain of the script that was written for event 201 and see, are there any holes in that script where instead of a patient zero spreading the infection, you have a super spreader who's a paid or an unwitting agent to develop a hotspot in the Wuhan city seafood market, right? Now that's
Or
interesting
the
because you
Walmart
remember,
in Shreveport, wherever that might be. We're hearing that
yes,
Louisiana is a hot spot now.
right, right. Now, remember, you and I went to Fishmongers Hall, right, in
Yep.
London, where there had been an event called, I think, Learning Together at Fishmongers Hall. They'd rented the hall, and Jack Merritt, who was a graduate of law at Cambridge University and had been dealing or working on that Learning Together program, with a guy called Usman Khan, who had been in jail and had an early release, but he was allegedly part of a terrorist network or a terrorist planning network. So I don't know whether Jack Merritt drove Usman Khan down to that conference,
We've
but they
heard
knew
that.
each other very well, right? Did you hear that?
Well, someone said that he did. I don't know if that person
Okay,
was
okay.
correct or incorrect.
So now at the Fishmongers Hall, which is one of the oldest livery companies in London, maybe there was a live action role play staged where various people had acts to various parts to play, overseen by the BBC because the BBC seems to have all the relevant videos of what went on. But anyway, apparently Usman Khan followed Jack Merritt into the washrooms, stabbed him, and then stabbed the female whose name was anyway. My apologies to her. I've forgotten her name. Right, and then runs out onto London Bridge where he's chased by ex-cons and various other people. One carrying a narwhal tusk, right,
Yeah.
and another carrying a fire extinguisher, and he's pushed down to the ground. The police are called. The people holding the individual Usman Khan on the ground back off, and then Usman Khan gets shot allegedly. But there is footage, I think, shown where the guy gets up afterwards.
Ole showed
Now,
that
is
to
that
us.
yeah? Shows it. So again, what we're dealing with, I think, right through this pandemic, right through 911, a live action role plays where the script is prepared by the BBC, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, that is put out there as news when in fact it's a combination of a simulation and a cover up, right? And the average person is unable to ground truth that because they don't have access to what would have happened if the simulation was corrupted. So if instead of patient zeros wandering around, we've got agents like potentially that woman who's been given some kind of vaccine where she can carry the virus into an area and create a hotspot. Now, the hotspot is the way in which you would ground truth the simulation. If the BBC and Event 201 had a simulation that was based on patient zeros, wandering around, or the virus jumping from the animal chain at the market into a human being. Both of those would be characterized by what I would call a patient zero spread. You don't see that in Wuhan City, and you're not seeing that in New York, and you're not seeing it in London. What you are seeing are hotspots being created, including a hotspot at number 10 Downing Street, the home of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who contracted or tested positive for the virus. Now, the White House is just as vulnerable to these people because they may not even know that they're carriers of the virus because they could have been vaccinated and then infected, right? They work in the White House. And the message going to Donald Trump is, Donald, you're not safe, right? We could send someone into one of your hotels. We could shut your hotel down. So what is he to do? He is faced a bit like George Bush on 9/11 with an unseen enemy, right? Perhaps a conspiracy so monstrous that the individual cannot believe it exists. And I'm saying that conspiracy is actually now, as a result of work that you and I have done, is manifestly obvious, I think, from our research. And it's the shareholders associated with SERCO, which I believe is a racketeering influence and corrupt organization based in the UK, and the Marriott hotel chain, which provides the permanent or perpetual or very convenient method of booking, let's say, convicts or ex-cons that have been vaccinated into a target area to carry out a very precise function using the Lemelson pattern, the vector pattern, a certain allowed the permitted and prohibited dwell time, which is spelt out using artificial intelligence algorithms as described in that patent taken out by Jerome Lemelson in 1998. Over to you.
Well, so this is interesting. I was showing before, David, when you were talking about hotspots, I was showing this Johns Hopkins heat map. That's the coronavirus, pandemic center of the world where everybody gets all their information. We've got a total confirmed 1 million people testing positive. In the United States, there's 6,605 deaths. New York, they're talking about 1,562. The thing that I'm looking into now is there some connection between SERCO and Johns Hopkins University? I just found this woman here, Pamela Drew. She's a globally focused P&L executive. And look at this. Pam is now serving as director of SERCO Inc., a wholly owned subsidiary of SERCO Group PLC, a $5 billion international business, and it's featured right here on Johns Hopkins. What do we think about that?
Well, that's new to me, but just going back, SERCO was charged but never brought into court for fraud on the taxpayer by charging the taxpayer for the transport of tagged prisoners who are either dead, back in jail, or never been in jail or overseas. Now, it's very interesting from a point of view of a forensic analysis or vector analysis, what happened to that case. It's a bit like the raid on Starnet, where everything's taken away and all the evidence. Nothing happened. Now, in the case of the SERCO, it turns out apparently there were 3,000 artificial reality prisoners with virtual tags. Now, wouldn't that be convenient if you wanted to deploy artificial reality prisoners or the prisoner hired for the day who'd received a vaccination or was terrified of receiving a vaccination, and you send them into Wuhan City, 5 of them. You don't even have to tell each other that they're going in there, but you create a hotspot, and the vector spread of that simulation is totally different from a patient zero that's picked up the infection from a civet cat or bat soup. So what I'm saying is now, I don't know whether what you just showed from Johns Hopkins University is actually a simulation. What I am saying is the way to test it is to take real data, empirical data, not just anecdotal data, coming from a scene where they say this hospital is overloaded, right, and compare it with the simulation. And if the simulation doesn't fit, the model is wrong. Now, whether it's consciously fraudulently, willfully, or recklessly wrong, doesn't matter. What I'm saying is the people who are dying as a result of this, they have a remedy for wrongful death, because a remedy for wrongful death I'm just going to make my position clear. I'm going to waive any interest in any payment like that might be made as a result of a civil action. Let's say the one brought by Erin Brockovich and her law firm against, PG&E?
Yeah.
Pacific, yeah, for the
Gas and
tainted
electric.
water.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I am saying is, whilst Erin Brockovich, a wonderful documentary, and I really enjoyed it, right, was about tainted water, what we're looking at here is about tainted blood. Very simple. A tainted blood scam that started in the 1970s at the University of Arkansas, that moved on or migrated or morphed into a scam run by the Clintons when Clinton was governor and Hillary Clinton was first lady of the state, on through a tainted blood racket on a global scale, where blood was bought from the prisoners at $7 a pint, sold on to Connaught Laboratories in Montreal at $50 a pint, processed into a plasma, and then used to infect, I believe maliciously intended to affect and sterilize and kill huge numbers of people. And the Clintons, I allege, have blood on their hands. Now, fast forward, Bill Clinton
Tainted
is a
blood
member of
on their
Phi Beta.
hands.
Sorry?
Tainted blood on their
Sorry?
hands. They have tainted blood on their hands.
So, being an engineer, I like to put a process together that results in some kind of remedy or solution for all the people who've been victimized by this corrupt process. And this morning I decided the groups that should be interested are, for example, the firefighters, the world traders, the insurers, the environmental cleaners, the information technologists, all of the kind of people that seems to have been targeted by a global criminal network engaged in what I would describe as guild socialism, right? So it's not communism, it's not anarcho-syndicalism. It's a targeted organization that says, for example, of or to the firefighters in New York, you're going to join this global network of firefighters, or we're going to kill you. Because killing 343 firefighters in two separate events under exactly the same circumstances, when the fire chief, Peter Gansey Jr., I'm quite sure is a perfectly capable individual. I believe he was hit with a couple of bullets from a Glock in the back of the head outside the North Tower. He would have known, had he appeared in court as an expert witness, that the communication systems supplied by Motorola Solutions, headquartered in Chicago, had been compromised so that the firefighters in the North Tower, and the North Tower collapsed after the second tower, even though the North Tower had been hit first, didn't get the order to evacuate. So I believe the firefighters have a remedy, or should have a remedy, against SERCO, whose chairman, Roy Gardner, is a fellow of the City and Guilds Institute of London, which was formed in 1892, about the year when Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle met for dinner at the Langham Hotel, where you and I were, hosted by the publisher of the Lippincott magazine, right? And those two individuals, remarkable individuals, right, very talented, they created this genre of Sherlock Holmes detective stories, which I love. I still do. I mean, I think they're marvelously written, etc. But isn't it interesting? Essentially, the author, Arthur Conan Doyle, is laying down a set of clues and delaying the appearance in the script of the book such that the reader is pulled in more and more, and the reader tries to beat the fictional Sherlock Holmes to identify the killer. But what happens if that technique developed by or perfected by Conan Doyle in the fiction has spilled over to the BBC? Remember, the BBC is...
David, did we lose you there? I think there's some internet trouble in Vancouver. David, have I got you back?
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm back. Okay, yeah, marvelous view there. Now, when we have, my understanding of the Masons is that there are two kinds of Masons. There are Freemasons and stonemasons. And stonemasons specialize in the blocks that go into the building. You know, you can see that there would be a lot of stonemasons at work on the broadcasting house. Now, the Freemasons are the people who do the sculpting. Right? Now, was Eric Gill a Freemason? I don't know. But you've got that image there of a bearded man holding a naked child, right, over the front door of Broadcasting House. And around the corner, if we can skid around a little bit, we have
well, remember,
image.
it doesn't, it's obscured in this Google Earth map.
Oh, yes, yes.
We've got to go to a different, let me bring it up while you explain to everyone what it is.
Okay. Yeah, so the other image just around the corner is a couple of angels, at least they've got wings, serenading, and I'm not sure if that's the right word, a naked sexualized boy Christ being crucified. And they're holding a book, or one of them is holding a book to his genitals, right, which has carving on it. And again, I thank the person who wrote into the show giving us a translation of obsculta. It's the first phrase from the Benedictine Creed, as I understand it, which tells you to listen and obey. That sculpture was put in place in 1934. I believe it's a desecration. I believe it's a symbol of something deeply worrying that has penetrated the BBC and now controls the narratives that we're getting about events such as 9/11 and the pandemic. And I'm saying, I think the BBC has been targeted for this level of entrapment and blackmail and extortion, just like many other organizations, including quite possibly SERCO and the Marriott hotels. But what we're looking at is a dark force.
David? Whoop. The dark force. Well, let's get David back here if we can. Trying to reconnect. There's nothing I can do in this moment. Oh, you back? David? Well, the thing that is interesting about this artwork outside of the BBC broadcasting house is that the term obsculta, listen and obey, it's what we're being told to do right now. Go inside your house and stay there. Do not walk around and question what's going on. Do not look at videos of empty hospitals when you're told that there are full hospitals. Are you back, David? David? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you intermittently, but...
Yeah, I think we're losing signal. So we're also getting very close to the end of our broadcast here. I was just reiterating to everyone that this term obsculta that is seen on the book in this bizarre sculpture, instructing everyone to listen and obey, is exactly what the BBC has been doing. I think the connection to David is becoming so intermittent, we might just end the broadcast pretty soon. I did look up Eric Gill, who is the totally bizarre and criminally perverted sculptor who made that sculpture of Ariel, what is it? I forget who the two, Prospero and Ariel. And we're not using Skype right now. And it doesn't say that he was a Freemason. It says that he was frustrated in his training and he took classes in stonemasonry at the Westminster Technical Institute. So perhaps people know more about that. In 1903, he gave up his architectural training to become a calligrapher. Oh, now we've lost David. So we'll have to just go to something else there. But our buddy Eric Gill, I don't know if he is a Freemason or not, but I hope that people have enjoyed this sample of David Hawkins' Discovery CSI. Other angel, I'll have to look into that, David Cohen. Possibly so. I hope people have enjoyed this special public broadcast of the ordinarily sponsor-exclusive David Hawkins Discovery CSI. People can watch us every week, and you can access the full library of sponsor-exclusive episodes If you go to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, you're going to get access to David's Patreon channel and all of the posts that David is making, as well as the library of David Hawkins Discovery CSI episodes. You can also gain access to a huge library of sponsor-exclusive content by becoming a sponsor on subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. David, are you back? I don't see you. Can you hear us? Okay, so I think we're going to wrap it up here, and don't forget to join me at 5 p.m. when we're going to have a brand new episode of John Cullen's coronavirus investigation. We've got a special guest today. We'll be joined by Shepard Ambellis of IntelliHub. So make sure you get over to Patreon and Subscribestar, become a sponsor, and enjoy the show. David, are you back? We'll be back next week. We'll see everybody then. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget, I couldn't do this without you, the viewers, sponsoring the show. Have a great day.